Okay.
I don't even know. I don't even know if I'm pregnant.
Sperm gets mixed with the ova somehow. It can be, you can do it one way, you can do it another way. There's lots of different ways to mix sperm with ova. You can have intercourse, sexual intercourse. Not a conversation, that doesn't work. You can have artificial insemination of one kind or another. They can take the ova out of the mother and they can put it in a petri dish and they can fertilize it with sperm outside the uterus. You can do that, and then you can take the ova and plant it back into the woman. You can do that if you want. That's ITV. That's IVT. I don't know. Anyway, interuterine. Well, anyway, you can do. There's a lot of different ways you can do it, but most people get pregnant by sexual intercourse. Intercourse just means two people communicating. So intercourse is like a conversation. Okay. I'm trying to teach you standing correct stuff. So. If he says intercourse, doesn't mean sexual. Probably doesn't mean sexual intercourse. He probably means conversation or just talking. So as soon as the ova is fertilized, the entity is referred to as a zygote. Zygote is Latin for yolk. That's what it means, because now all of a sudden the yolk is going to become a baby. The clock's ticking on the germinal phase. Germinal phase only lasts for 2 weeks. One of the things that happens is, of course, the ova goes into the fallopian tube, and that's where it's usually fertilized, in the fallopian tube. This is not a very good picture of a fallopian tube because fallopian tubes are actually bigger than that, and eggs are a lot smaller than that.
I thought the fallopian tubes are smaller.
Fallopian tubes,
I thought it's the size of a noodle.
It is. It's the size of a noodle. But yeah. the ova is just like one cell.
Oh yeah.
Okay. So it's really, really tiny. And it looks like this one's about to get stuck. Because as this thing starts to
roll,
to grow, exactly, it'll get stuck in here, and that's known as an ectopic pregnancy. You can imagine how uncomfortable that would be. As a matter of fact, it's excruciatingly painful.
I would say that sounds painful.
There's nothing you can do. There's no way you can get the baby out, and it blows out the fallopian tube. It expands until it destroys the fallopian tube, and that's known as an ectopic pregnancy. Something to worry about only if you are at that stage of pregnancy. Okay. But if you're not at this stage of pregnancy, don't worry about it. Don't even think about it. However, my second wife, her fourth husband. Anyway, she got pregnant. She had an ectopic pregnancy. She still complains about it. Or last time I talked to her, she was still complaining about it. The germinal stage lasts for the first 2 weeks of life and doesn't end until the zygote implants itself into the uterine wall and ties itself into the mother's circulatory system. At this stage, the baby becomes a parasite. Well, it's just one way of looking at it, because the baby is going to start stealing nutrients from the mother. Now the problem is that the mother isn't a good girl, and she doesn't eat right, and she doesn't take her vitamins like she's supposed to. Doesn't take the calcium. The baby will suck the calcium right out of your body, and all those vitamins. And the mother will suffer, and the baby will not. The baby's going to get whatever the hell the baby wants. Does that make it a parasite? Kind of. The baby has to protect itself, and the way it protects itself is with human chorionic gonadotropin. Human chorionic gonadotropin is a way of masking this alien structure as a structure of the mother. And it's known as human chorionic gonadotropin. Now, the fun thing about human chorionic gonadotropin is that when we do a pregnancy test to find out if somebody's pregnant, what do we measure? We measure human chorionic gonadotropin. So the more cells that we have, each one is being protected by this human chorionic gonadotropin. And of course it's being sloughed off into the mother's urine. And as that happens, of course, the more cells we have, the more human chorionic gonadotropin we have, the more human chorionic gonadotropin we have, the more likely we're going to be able to tell if she's pregnant or not. Now that's a good thing, because human chorionic gonadotropin allows the baby live, to survive without the mother's immune system destroying it. That's a good thing. However, when cancers metastasize, when they move from one place to another, the reason they can move from one place to the other without being destroyed by the individual's immune system is because they start producing human chorionic gonadotropin. So now if you've got cancer, and I've had cancer, if you've got cancer, and it metastasizes, now your immune system can't knock it out. Now, I've never had cancer that metastasized. We always caught it before it grew, in which case my immune system had it already encapsulated it. It had kept it from growing. It kept it from going anyplace else. And I'm still alive. But some people, of course, that doesn't happen. If you're immunocompromised, and you've got cancer, now suddenly, of course, you have a difficult time destroying that cancer. Okay, so what's happening? Okay, so the baby has snaked its way into the mother's circulatory system. So now it's getting blood from the mother, which is a good thing because that's the way it gets its nutrients. Now the bad thing is that if the mother's not a good girl, and she does things like drinks alcohol or shoots up with heroin, now the baby gets heroin and alcohol too, because of course it crosses the placental barrier, and now the baby's a user just like mom is. And of course this happened to me, my great-niece, when she had my great-great-nephew, she was a heroin user. And so he was born addicted to heroin, as ugly as that is. From the 3rd to the 8th week, the entity will be referred to as an embryo, and the stage is the embryonic stage, zygote, germinal stage, embryo, embryonic stage. After the 8th week, the entity enters the fetal stage, and the structure becomes known as a fetus. So here we are right here. We're right here. We are in the embryonic stage. A full pregnancy is 38 weeks. It's 38 weeks. Who was I talking? Oh, Marius' wife is pregnant. She's going to have a baby next month. The beginning of next month. They just figured it out. The baby weighs a little over 5 pounds. I know. And it's got about a month to go.
Is he still there?
Marius? Yeah, he's here.
Oh.
Sure.
I think it was like 10 pounds when I was born.
Just a baby.
You're an elephant.
I know.
It's crazy.
It's a good thing you stopped growing. My goodness, you'd weigh 500 pounds. Any baby born before the 35th gestation week is considered preterm, and that very rarely happens. They're still in this stage, however. If she gives birth tomorrow, the baby will be preterm. Anything between 35th week and the 38th week is full term. The baby's already 5 pounds. Now, the usual cutoff for an underweight baby is 5.5 pounds. So her baby is already at 5.5 pounds, and he's probably okay. Each sperm and ova will contain 23 chromosomes, so that after fertilization, the chromosomes will match up to create 23 pairs of 46 total chromosomes. And this is how we decide how pretty you're going to be, or how ugly you're going to be, or whatever. Whether you're going to be tall or short, whether you're going to need glasses, and all 3 of you have glasses on. All of this is determined by the chromosomes. As weird as that is.
There's this one saying that Ron says, I think it was in the psychology.
Okay.
You're saying that individuals with glasses, they're highly sexually active?
What? What do glasses have to do with sexual activity? Men don't make passes at girls who wear glasses.
I don't know.
I
That's
don't
what he
know.
said.
Okay. He's just making it up. He was wearing glasses when he said it, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah. He's such a funny guy. No, one thing has absolutely nothing to do with the other. However, my wife finds me more attractive when she takes her glasses off, so. That's a good thing, okay? She doesn't see very well without her glasses on, so I can tell her just about anything. And she sometimes will agree with it. The last chromosome in the sequence is of chromosomes that determines the biological gender of the, this determines the biological gender of the baby. This baby is a XX baby. Okay. This baby, oops, I'm sorry, I'm with the wrong direction. This is a boy, the other one was a girl. You can see the Y chromosome. You can see this is a problem because boys have a really short chromosome. And the mother, of course, has an X chromosome, and that's nice and big. Do we know if it's a boy or a girl?
Yeah. Oh, it's a girl.
Oh, okay. She's lucky. She's got estrogen to protect, oh, I'm sorry. She's got estrogen to protect herself, and the two X chromosomes cancel each other out. So if you have a flaw on your X chromosome and your husband, okay, your husband has his X chromosome. If you have a problem on yours, it's canceled out by your husband's X chromosome. Isn't that great? Okay, that's really good because there are a lot of problems that can happen with the short chromosome, with this short chromosome. If there's a flaw on the X chromosome, now we got a problem.
Like what do you mean? What kind of flaw?
Hemophilia, muscular dystrophy, color blindness is on there. Male pattern baldness is on the X chromosome, is on this chromosome. So there's not a whole lot, but there are some things that can happen that really mess the kid up. And it always happens to boys because if it's a female, she probably has two X chromosomes and one X chromosome will cancel out the flaw.
Outweighs his?
Exactly.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah, it will cancel it out.
So when you were talking about like people being alcoholics and heroin addicts, it does affect the genetics or the epigenetics?
It does, but there are a lot of different spots where it affects the genetics.
So the chromosome could affect the chromosomes too?
Will it change the chromosomes?
Yeah.
There are certain things that you can do to yourself to change your chromosomes. One of them is smoke pot. Pot not only messes up your sperm if you're a male, if you're a female you don't have to worry about it, but it also changes the chromosomes. So we're not exactly sure. Not yet. We haven't done enough studies with marijuana.
I was just thinking about like Down syndrome people.
They have 3 chromosomes on the 21st pair. They have three chromosomes here. That doesn't have anything to do with drugs or alcohol. It's just a genetic flaw. Okay, well, I'm going to talk about my daughter. My daughter was 42 years old when she got pregnant, which is old for, yeah, it's a little bit old for getting pregnant. She hated babies, she hated kids, just hated them. She's a teacher, she hated kids. And finally, when she's 42 years old, her biological clock started beating like a bass drum or something. And she decided that she'd get pregnant. So she got pregnant at 42 and had the baby at 43. So both of us are very knowledgeable. She's a biology teacher and I teach this stuff. So we were scared, both of us were scared to death. We were watching her have the baby while she was getting pregnant, just having morning sickness, all the things that women get to go through. She had to have an amniocentesis because there's always a probability that since she's so old that there will be a genetic problem with the baby. If you're a young pup like Monique is, then nothing to worry about. Well, there is, but there's not. Not nearly as much as my daughter, because she's 42 years old. She's an old, really, really old person to be having a baby. Okay, so if it were up to women, they would only have girl babies. I don't know why, but all the ova's are X chromosomes.
I heard that, like, there's a way of doing that, using bone marrow or something?
What?
Being pregnant using bone marrow, and then in return, the baby's gonna end up being female. I read that somewhere, I don't know. It was just really quickly.
Whose bone marrow are we using? Are we using the mother's bone marrow? Because all of her chromosomes are the same. If she has a genetic flaw, then that flaw is going to be repeated in the baby. It's going, if it's a genotype, as far as she's concerned, a hidden trait, and it's a flaw, then it will probably become a dominant trait. And that's dangerous. This is the reason that incest is not practiced. Because otherwise we get the same genes, the same gene structure,
Right.
and there's always a possibility that some ugly thing will come out. This is one of the reasons why clones are so dangerous. Okay. They're difficult. We may get something that we don't know, we don't expect. What are we doing? It is the male chromosome that determines whether the baby will be born as a male or a female, a sperm with an X chromosome or a Y chromosome. So it was the old man that was the guy that, and he was the one that made that baby a girl. Didn't have anything to do with you. If it was up to you, you would have all girl babies. It was a female sperm. It gets a little bit dicey at this stage. I can tell you when you got pregnant. Do you want to know? Are you sure? If you get pregnant while you're ovulating, right in the middle of your period, you're going to have a boy baby. If you get pregnant in the beginning or at the end of your cycle, your ovulatory cycle, then you have a girl baby. How's that? Okay.
Makes
So
sense.
yeah, it's
Just
not-
kidding.
doesn't have anything to do with anything. Some people are trying to have boy babies and they get into select sexual positions in order, it's, none of it makes any sense. It has to do with when you have sex. If you have sex at the beginning of your ovulatory cycle, then you're more likely to have a girl, or at the end, you're more likely to have a girl. If it's right in the middle, you're more likely to have a boy. They have estimated that 70% of all babies that are impregnated are male, because it's right in the middle of your ovulatory cycle. Boy babies do not survive as readily as female babies do. For lots of different reasons, tons of different reasons. One of them has to do with the fact that the person carrying the baby is a female. And the female baby is less alien to her than the male baby, than a male zygote is. So if she were just to destroy the zygote, she would destroy a male zygote over a female zygote.
So like last class, we were talking about how we get or become immune to different sicknesses, like I guess like unconsciously or,
Mhm.
you know, is there a time like when I guess females develop some type of way to just have boys or girls within a certain year? Like does their body become immune to these different bacteria?
You know, that's really an interesting question, and we really haven't answered that question yet. Females, oh geez, how can I talk about this? Okay. Okay, so let's say you're married to somebody for 20 years, and you have sex every night. Okay. Or every other night, I don't care. How often do you want to have? No, you have sex a lot. The female will produce antibodies against the male's sperm. Okay, because this is something that, it's like coming in contact with a cold virus. So the more you come in contact with the cold virus, the stronger the antibodies are. Well, it's the same way with sperm. Sperm, you know, that's totally alien structure. It's something that needs to be destroyed.
So if she would have an affair, then she would become
She would get pregnant by the guy that she's having an affair with. I know, it's ugly. We've done studies looking at this. And what we've discovered is she's a lot more likely to get impregnated by
Yeah.
The other guy?
the
That
other
explains a
guy.
lot.
Yeah, it really does. I mean, it's really kind of strange. They've done all kinds of interesting studies. If the husband thinks that she's shacking up with somebody else, like she's having an affair with somebody, then he will produce more sperm to counteract the other guy's sperm. And they've done studies looking at this as well, as bizarre as that is. They've looked at these studies, and what they've discovered is that the male will produce more sperm, trying to counteract the other guy's sperm. But the reality is she's already developed antibodies against her husband's sperm, because she has sex with him all the time. But the new guy, his sperm are totally alien as far as she's concerned. And she's more likely to get pregnant. You know, her immune system will fight her husband's sperm, will destroy her husband's sperm, but they won't destroy her boyfriend's sperm. As weird as that is. I guess it's not that weird.
Interesting. It's interesting.
I have an uncle who has, I usually borrow my Navajo regalia from my auntie's family because they have 7 sisters, and like I just borrow stuff from them.
Do they all look alike? 7 sisters, huh? Anyway, okay, so that's the bad news and the good news. Each cell in the human body contains the same genetic fingerprint or deoxyribonucleic acid. This is a famous DNA that we talk about all the time. All the individual sex cells, the sperm in the males and the ova in the females, have 23 chromosomes, and they're the only cells in the body that don't have 46 chromosomes. They only have 23 chromosomes. And the reason
male?
is because they have to come together.
The male? What?
Males have, their sperm has 23 chromosomes, the ova has 23 chromosomes.
Oh, okay.
So when they come together, now there's 46. You don't want a 47th chromosome. That's what happens with Down syndrome.
Oh, okay.
Oh, yeah, you don't want
Makes
that.
sense. Oh, right, like you said, if it adds on a third one to
Now we
the
got a problem.
21st, whatever.
Exactly.
Makes sense.
21st chromosome. Trisomy 23. 21, I'm sorry.
21.
Yeah, there's trisomy 23 as well. We see individuals that are XYY. In other words, they get the male, the sperm has 2 Y chromosomes. So the individual is XYY, and of course he's not fully functional either. We have another situation where it's an empty chromosome, it's an XO. This is known as Klinefelter syndrome, where the individual develops as a female, but they don't really mature. There's an actress who has Klinefelters. What's her name? The lady on LA, in NCIS Los Angeles, the little short lady, she has Klinefelter syndrome. She can't reproduce. Okay, not that that's important. At the 2-week mark after fertilization, the zygote must implant on the uterine wall. If all factors aren't perfect, the zygote will not implant and be swept out of the uterus along with the menstrual flow. But it's not this. You can't really refer to this as a spontaneous abortion. It just didn't implant. Now it was fertilized. The ova was fertilized, but it just didn't implant. Fewer than half of all zygotes implant properly on the uterine wall, and of course, this is one of the reasons why there are so few babies, and why women don't get pregnant every month. If they're viable, why they just don't get pregnant over and over and over again. And it's normally because there's something wrong with the uterine wall. It's not vascularized enough, there's not enough blood there. Usually if it's a female fetus, it will implant low, and if it's a male fetus, it will implant high. How's that? However, that's not absolute. Don't write that down. Christine, I could have sworn Christine was going to have a girl baby, but she had a boy baby. And she was carrying it really low. It should have been a boy baby.
I thought it
Should have been a girl baby.
The lower it is, it's a boy, and then the higher it is, it's a
It's
girl.
the other way around, I think.
I don't think so. I just saw that too.
Oh, really?
Like, yeah.
Maybe you're right. Maybe I got it backwards. Maybe I've got it backwards. Maybe that's why I thought
Maybe.
Christine was going to have the wrong kind of baby. With the embryonic phase, and the structure begins to look like a human being. The brain begins to develop at this stage. The head begins to form in the 4th week. A primitive heart begins to beat between the 4th and the 5th week. Now, you hear a lot of stories about after 18 days, the heart starts beating after 18 days. That is incorrect. It does not. It doesn't start beating until the 4th or 5th week. The baby doesn't have a heart until the 4th week, and it doesn't start beating until the 4th or 5th week. At the 9th week, 2 months, the embryo is 1 inch long and weighs about 1 gram, and the mother probably isn't showing yet. All of the adult organs have formed except the sex organs, and the structure starts being called a fetus. Really kind of weird. I've known women that knew they were pregnant almost immediately, and usually they said it's because their breasts started to drop, and the areola of their nipples got darker, which happens. It's really kind of strange. Anyway, well, it's not that strange, I guess. We need to feed the baby, don't we? Okay, so let's go ahead and let that happen. All the adult organs have formed except the sex organs, and the structure starts being called a fetus because it looks human at this stage. In the 9th week, sex organs develop, and if the fetus is a male, the testes begin bathing the fetus with copious amounts of testosterone. Testosterone, that's what makes the baby a boy. Now if the fetus starts being bathed with testosterone and it's a girl, now we got a problem, because the girl baby will develop as a female, because all of her parts are female parts, but she'll have a male brain. Is there a difference between a male brain and a female brain? Yes, there is. There's a difference between the two. First of all, the male brain is larger, which it doesn't make them any smarter. Unfortunately, it doesn't make them any smarter. Okay. Between the 4th and the 6th month, the brain will increase in size by a factor of 6. So this is when the baby's brain is being developed, and this is when the mother needs to make sure that she's feeding that baby's brain. Starting in the 4th month, brain cells will increase exponentially at the rate of 500,000 cells per minute. Is that all? Just 500,000? Babies have survived as young as 21 weeks. As a matter of fact, did anybody see the State of the Union address? Because there was a little baby that was 2 years old, I'm sorry. She was 2 years old, and she was the first baby that was 21 weeks gestation to be born and survive. She was less than a pound when she was born, and there she was at the State of the Union. Not exactly sure why. Don't ask me why he does anything. That's the President of the United States. Of course, this is on video. He'll probably send the cops after me or something. Babies have survived 21 weeks, okay, but 22nd week. And this was a big deal as far as my daughter and I were concerned, because, as I said, she was 42 years old, and she was going to give birth at age 43. And so we were both just on pins and needles until she passed that 22-week mark, because we both wanted to make, I wanted a grandbaby really, really bad, probably worse than she wanted a baby. Anyway, I really wanted a baby. And then I had somebody to take care of. Each day of growth, because you guys are kind of boring, you're adults. Adults are the most boring people in the whole wide world. But babies are just a blast. And little kids, as they're growing up, oh, they are just a hoot, aren't they? Mm-hmm. You guys, and then they become teenagers, and then they become as boring as hell. Is that the way it works? Yeah, well, that's the way it seemed to work for me. Each day of growth within the womb during the last trimester increases the fetus's possibility of survival. And of course, one of the jobs that I had was working in NICU and taking care of these little premature babies. And most of them survived, some of them didn't, but most of them survived. Usually, as long as they were intact, as long as they had all their body parts in the right place, then they survived. We were able to allow them to survive. But of course, we saw some pretty ugly things. Most traits are determined by many different genes, and this is known as polygenic. So a lot of things have to do with whether you're an alcoholic or whether you're a drug addict. That's a polygenic thing. So it takes flaws in different places in order for you to become one of these people. The genes that are expressed are a person's phenotype. So the fact that you have brown eyes, brown eyes, brown eyes, brown eyes. Everybody has brown eyes. I have blue eyes. And the fact that my eyes are blue, that's my phenotype. Your brown eyes, that's your phenotype. But if you had blue-eyed ancestry, but you have brown eyes, then you would have inherited a blue-eyed trait which you didn't express. And that would be your genotype. Your hidden traits are your genotype. Now this isn't really important. We don't really care about what your genotype is. unless we're cross-matching your blood or we're trying to find out if you need a transplant, if we're looking for somebody to transplant with you, for you, an organ or whatever. Then we have to look at your genotype. And the reason we do is because if that doesn't mesh, if that doesn't agree with one another, then you'll reject the organ. Or you'll reject the blood. If you hit him, that's abuse as well. So go ahead and punch him, I won't tell anybody, that's okay. Okay, so a person's genotype, their phenotype is what we see, their genotype is what we don't see. So if you had ancestry that had blonde hair or red hair, but of course everybody has black hair, that would be your genotype. This gets really interesting. I had a niece who had red hair. Her mom had brown hair and her dad had brown hair, but she had red hair, so what happened? Was it the mailman that gave her the red hair? No, it was, they both had red hair genotype, and that's why she had red hair. Most genes are non-additive. One gene is dominant over the other, and that is the trait that is expressed. However, there are some genes that are additive. In other words, the expressed traits are a combination of the genes so that one is not dominant over the other. Height and skin tone appear to be additive. This is really kind of interesting. I had a friend when I was in the service, and he was the darkest man I have ever met. He was so black. And he married a lady with red hair. Well, if you've ever been around red-headed people, they don't have any skin tone at all. I mean, they're almost blue. They're so pale, as ugly as that sounds. Anyway, so the two of them, they started making babies. And by golly, each one was just a trip, because you never knew what color hair they were going to have or what color their skin was going to be. And they were always born white. They were always born really pale. And then as they got older, their skin would darken a little bit, or their hair would change color. It was just fascinating to watch these kids develop. Just a ton of fun. He was the nicest guy in the world. She was kind of a, what's the word I'm looking for? Rhymes with witch. Yeah, that's it. But he was the nicest guy in the world, and I always thought, geez, I am so sorry that he married this horrible, horrible lady, because she was just as mean as a snake. But their kids were just a joy. They were just so much fun. And of course, here we have an individual that is relatively pale, and her husband is a little bit darker. And as you can see, their offspring are all different hues and all different hair colors and whatnot, which is just a lot of fun. While most genes are either expressed or unexpressed and are tied to dominance and recessiveness, some genetic structures are adaptive and can be expressed by conditions in the environment. The study of these genes is referred to as epigenetics. These genes can be influenced by such factors as the food that you eat, whether you're getting the right food or not, the climate that you live in. Remember, that was in the other class. We're talking about Neanderthals. One of the reasons Neanderthals looked the way that they did, or acted the way that they did, or survived the way that they did, is because they were living in the Ice Age, and it was really damn cold where they were, and they had to cover themselves up, so they needed to be able to absorb as much sunlight as they possibly could. Vitamin D, it's not the sunlight that's important, it's the vitamin D in the sunlight, in order for them to convert it into calcium, so that their bones would be nice and strong. So what happened with the Neanderthal man was that they came up from Africa, probably as dark as anybody in Africa, and the ones that were the darkest were the ones that didn't survive in that environment. The ones that did survive were the ones that were the palest. And so in time, as they reproduced more and more and more, they became paler and paler and paler, and that potentially that's why there are select people that are very, very relatively pale in the world. How about that? Because it was a survival. They were adapting to that environment. Now, if we look at the native tribes, we can see all different hues of individuals, and potentially the ones that live up farther up to the north are lighter complexioned than people that live in the south. So the people that lived in the Mojave Desert, the Mojaves that lived in the desert, individuals that lived in that type of an environment were lighter, were darker skinned. What type of medical care did they get, or what type of the lack of any medicine that they were encountering? Economic situation would change the epigenetics. Your culture would potentially change your epigenetics, make you more adaptive or less adaptive, and of course historical context. Once upon a time, the Japanese decided that they were going to conquer the Pacific Rim. One of the problems with the Pacific Rim is that not only do you have Alaska, where it's really, really cold, and the Aleutian Islands, but you also have the South Pacific with all those other, the South Pacific, where it's hot as hell, okay? It's a tropical environment. So the Japanese decided that they needed to do that. The Japanese decided that they needed to be able to conquer the tropics. They needed to conquer that area. And one of the things that they did, of course, they tried to adapt, select individuals to fight in the tropics. And if you know anything about the battle for the South Pacific between the United States and Japan, one of the things that happened was that the Japanese soldiers suffered from the heat. They suffered from the really hot and humid environment. They sweat like pigs, okay? They had a problem with it. People in the United States, not so much, because we had people from the South. We had natives that we sent out there, people from this area. So it's one of the reasons why the Navajo went to the South Pacific. Why didn't the Navajo go to the European theater? Because you were more adaptive to that type of an environment. And the soldiers that fought in the South Pacific tended to be from the South, and they were the ones that survived more readily in that environment. The individuals from the northern tier of the United States, people from my area, from Indiana, from North Dakota, from Montana, instead of sending them out to the Pacific, they sent them to Europe, to fight in Europe. Why? Because they were more adapted to that environment, as weird as that may seem. The Japanese really had a serious problem with this. They wanted to change people's genes so that they could fight in that type of an environment, but it didn't work. They could never do it. So it was kind of that's epigenetics. That has to do with epigenetics, as weird as that is. You guys are from this part of the world. You live in the desert, kind of. It's hot here in the summertime. It's not as hot where I come from. So I sweat a lot more than you guys do. It's just genes. It's epigenetics. I'm from, we used to take off not all of our clothes, of course, that would be silly. we used to ride on the tractors without any shirts on, but you guys don't do that kind of stuff. And you never walk around without jeans on, right? But we used to walk around with shorts on all the time. Shorts, pair of gym shoes, and that was pretty much it. We didn't have much more clothes on than that. But it was the environment that we were living in. Each DNA structure has extra genetic material that was previously thought to be excess and unnecessary material. We thought that it was genetic junk. But of course, geneticists have discovered that when methyl groups are added to the extra material, it changes the gene to either express or to turn off the gene. And so we get a choice between two different genes, two different adaptations. So if we get the right food, then one of the genes is expressed. If we don't get that food, we get in that feast and famine situation, then another gene is expressed. Now, so what does that mean for people here on the reservation? If you guys were in feast and famine, I mean, you live in a desert, so there's not a whole hell of a lot of food here. But the people that lived up in the north, especially in the northeast, the woodlands, those individuals had all the food in the world. They had lots and lots of food. But people living down here, of course, they didn't have, it was a feast and famine situation. So because of that, what gene was turned on? Well, the gene that was turned on was the one that craves fat and the one that craves sugar. Yeah, But those guys, they didn't have the same problem. So natives from that portion of the United States, people from the woodlands, they didn't develop with the same diabetic tendencies that you guys have. Sorry about that. Just the way it works.
What if you were born there? And-
Came out here?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, you'd probably starve to death. Sad as it would be. They didn't do that though, did they? If they just moved west, they didn't move southwest. So even the southeastern tribes that they moved out of Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi, you know, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Seminole, the Cherokee, and the Creek, all those tribes that they moved to Oklahoma, that was still Oklahoma, where there's a lot more game than there is here. A lot more grasslands than there are here. So they kind of moved them from one really positive environment to one that's not quite as positive, but it's not as negative as moving them into the desert. Living in New Mexico, for example, or Arizona. I always question why somebody moved from Wisconsin to Tucson. Just a thought.
There's remarkable beauty in this
Ah,
part of the
right,
country.
it's the beauty, it doesn't have anything to do with the food.
And I
Well,
think there's also a lot of food out there.
yeah,
That we just
okay.
don't-
Well, luckily you have grocery stores now, we don't have to worry about adapting to the environment. But you know, when I would visit my daughter lived in Phoenix, and I would go visit her, I'd sweat like a pig when I was in Phoenix. I was living in Mississippi at the time. Hot, it's so damn hot, and it's dry heat. It just cooks you. I don't know. Mississippi, I had a better time in Mississippi than I did in Phoenix. Epigenetics appears to come into play the strongest during the perinatal period, just before and just after an individual is born. Thus, when infants are exposed to environmental stressors early in life, such as pollution or family conflicts, it may affect their reactions throughout their lives. And this is one of the things we discovered by looking at soldiers coming out of Vietnam, the individuals that had been in family conflicts, that had been traumatized as children. These were the ones that suffered the worst PTSD. The individuals that didn't have trauma in their childhood were less likely to develop PTSD. I told you the story of my three brothers and me. We all went to Vietnam, and one of us came back with PTSD. The other three have minor cases of PTSD, but my brother with the severe case of PTSD was an individual that suffered from rheumatic fever when he was 3 years old. He was homeschooled for a year because of scarlet fever. So this is and he was the one that developed the worst PTSD. The other three of us have minimal cases, hardly anything bad at all. You know, my case has to do with smelling mutton, has to do with mutton. But of course, this is where asthma comes from. Asthma can have something to do with family conflicts or the pollution that an individual lives in. And this is one of the reasons why kids from from lower socioeconomic areas in cities, why they develop asthma far more readily than individuals that live in the country. You know, I grew up on a farm. I guess I'm lucky I grew up on a farm because it was, you know, no pollution. It smelled like pigs, but I don't know, dude, that's not pollution, is it? Anyway, that's into chapter whatever. Let's go to the next chapter. The next chapter is about stress. Stress is a lot of fun. We'll talk about it. Anybody have any questions about jeans? Or your clothes? A different spelling.
This is chapter 4, right?
I'm sorry?
We're going on to chapter 4.
Yeah, we're going on to chapter 4. This is the 5th week, so I should be on chapter 5. So obviously I'm a whole chapter behind. All right. We're going to find my clicker. There we go. Okay, chapter 4 is about stress.
Hello.
Okay. This is Hans Seogi. I know. 1934, he discovered that when under stress, most animals will react in a similar manner. They react one way or they react the other. This he referred to as the stress response. As humans, of course, we have a stress response. They respond almost the same way to all stressors. Dogs will attack if they're under a lot of stress. One time I was traveling between, where was I? California, and we were moving to Washington, D.C. My wife had new orders, and she was supposed to go to headquarters in Washington, D.C. So we stopped in Oklahoma City that night, and we had 2 dogs. We had one was a 3-legged red Doberman, and then the other one was a pointer, was a goofy pointer. And so this guy decided he was going to bring his dogs over to see our dogs. You know how dogs just love to be around each other. Well, the pointer, of course, was an idiot, not the brightest dog in the world, and he attacked the other dog. So when he attacked the one dog, my 3-legged Doberman, the sweetest dog in the world that never bit anybody, all of a sudden, because there was an attack mode had occurred, he started biting, and the first thing that he came in contact with was the back of my leg. This is a dog that loved me desperately, that would never hurt me, but because of that stress, because it was triggered in him, he just started snapping. And when he grabbed me by the back of the leg. And of course he was a Doberman pinscher, and I don't know if you've ever seen their mouths, but it looks like one of those monster things. Like an alligator. It was pretty bad. He got me on the back of the leg. That's the only time he ever did anything that was aggressive toward me, and the reason he did was because of stressors. Okay, so all animals will react in the same manner under stress. So that's what happened with him. I don't trust dogs. If a dog gets in a negative situation, they're just going to attack. That's the way they are. They're pack animals. Stressors can sometimes make you sick. So if you're immunocompromised, you might get sick. Once upon a time, I got fired. It's the last time I've ever been fired. 10 days after I was fired, I had a heart attack. Why in the world did that happen? Well, it was a stressor. It was a stressor that I had never come in contact with before. I'd been in combat, I'd been in really negative situations. I used to work in emergency rooms, and we would get, masses of, car crashes, and we would have gunfights, and all these people are coming in, and, you're plugging holes with your finger, trying to stop the dike, that kind of stuff. All this stuff happened. I never got sick. Never bothered me at all. Then I got fired. I got fired once, and I had a heart attack. Okay. So sometimes, if you're under a lot of stress, you will get sick, and that's like the only time I ever get sick. That's the only time I've ever gotten sick. I never get sick. If the flu's around, I never catch it. It's just the way it works. Everybody's got a cold. I don't have one. But then again, I worked in medicine for such a long time. A stressor is any event or situation that triggers coping adjustments in an individual. Stress is the process by which we perceive and respond to events that are perceived as harmful, threatening, or challenging. I've been through a lot of situations. I'm not a very tall person. You probably may have noticed that. I'm not very tall. So trying to play basketball in Indiana, where basketball is not just a sport, it's a religion. It was fairly stressful, but I never, I didn't react to it. Before an event stresses us, we must read the event as threatening or even beyond our coping ability. And of course, when I got fired, I had no recourse. There was nothing I could do. I was teaching at a select institution, and they fired me, and I had a heart attack 10 days later. Now, the bizarre part was that why didn't I have a heart attack right away? Well, what happened was I was playing in the state softball tournament, and this is a positive event. And since I went through that positive event, I didn't react to the stress until after the softball tournament was over with. I hit .875 in the softball tournament. It was a slow pitch softball tournament, so everybody gets hits. Okay, I didn't want you to think that that I'm that good a ball player. I was okay, but I mean, I did really, really well in the softball tournament. And for that reason, I didn't react to the stress until afterwards. At that stage, I hadn't finished my PhD yet. I just been fired. We thought we were going to live there for the rest of our lives, and we didn't, obviously, since we're down here. So I had a negative reaction to it, but it was delayed until after the softball tournament, as weird as that sounds. Thus, a stressful event isn't as much the event itself, but how we read the event. And of course, this was another situation where I had to interpret what was happening to me. As long as I was playing in the softball tournament, I played on a native ball team. So all my native friends were there. We had a really good ball tournament. We came in 4th in the state, and I hit .875. Anyway, so I did really well, had a good time, I had all my friends around me. Once the tournament was over with, I went home and realized that I was in a really negative situation. Didn't have a job. We were in some place that I couldn't stay because there was no work up there, and so that I'd have to leave the people I thought I'd live with for the rest of my life. It was a really negative situation. And eventually we did leave. A stressor for one person may be a piece of cake for somebody else. Some people get fired all the time. Doesn't mean anything to them. But me, I get fired one time, I have a heart attack. I'm a wimp, okay? There's something wrong with me. Short-lived events or events perceived as challenging can have a positive effect on us, like mobilizing our immune system to fight off infection and promote healing. And of course, that's what happens. And so anytime I feel like I'm catching a cold, one of the things I do is I either lift weights or I go out and run. And if I do that, then usually I don't get sick. Well, I never get sick. So. Is if I run or if I marshal all of my resources.
So what about like individuals that were like abused and experienced excessive trauma when they were younger? Could they like...
You need to stay away from trauma the rest of your life.
Could they be healthier, I guess, in a way?
No, that's not usually the way it works. Usually if something traumatic happens, then they have a negative reaction to it. Like what happened with the soldiers coming back from Vietnam. About a third of the people coming back from Vietnam had PTSD really bad. To the extent that they became drug addicts, they became alcoholics, they became abusive husbands, they lost their spouses. As long as they weren't in a traumatic situation, they were fine. They got married, they had a happy life, went into combat, which is not a positive, usually it's not a positive thing, unless you're a sociopath. These individuals came out of combat with PTSD. Then when they went home, of course, their coping mechanism was whatever they learned when they were a child. And if it was taking drugs, that's what they did. If it was drinking alcohol, that's what they did. If it was abusing their family, I mean, you learn things, you learn your coping techniques from the way that you're raised. So if you learn that if in a negative situation you're supposed to beat somebody up or start drinking heavily, so then you can do whatever you want because you're not responsible for yourself, then that's what you'll do. We learn our coping techniques from the people that we grow up with. They teach us our coping techniques. We see it in them. Okay, I'm assuming that the trauma came from someplace. And it probably came from the parents. In the 1950s, Holmes and Rahe put together a list of significant life events by interviewing 5,000 people. Fascinating. These guys, they went through the 1950s accumulating all these life events. They assigned each event life change units to demonstrate how much disruption or change took place with the event. They came up with tens of thousands of stressful life events. Life change units, and they applied life change units to all of them. They're just two really fun guys. Holmes and Rahe constructed the social readjustment rating scale the SRRS, a measurement that attempts to quantify life events in terms of life change units. The SRRS was the first systematic effort to link stress and illness. Now, this is really kind of bizarre because they did all this assuming that everything was absolute. They came up with this structure, so they were assuming, that, of course, that this is the way it was going to work. The authors would add up the LCUs accumulated from life events and predict whether the individual was prone to disease process in the coming months. Okay, so what are some of the most devastating things that can happen to you? Death. Okay, death of a family member, death of a child. Second was divorce, interestingly enough. Well, that's not that interesting, I guess.
What about like sickness,
I'm sorry?
like cancer or AIDS?
Well, AIDS, this is the 1950s.
Syphilis.
AIDS, we didn't even discover AIDS until the 1980s. Okay, right. Well, cancer though. Let's say cancer. Disease of one kind or another. A lot of people smoking cigarettes back in the 50s. Over half the population were cigarette smokers. Lots of people are dying of lung cancer in their 50s and 60s. So yeah, that was one of them. So what are we doing? Okay. Research conducted on a naval crew found that the sailors with high LCUs were more prone to illness during their voyage than those with low LCUs. That's very logical. These individuals were more, they had more life stressors, therefore they were more likely to become sick during the voyage. But the SRRS and other similar instruments, and these weren't the only guys that were coming up with these types of measurements, did have their critics. Many of the items are vague and open to subjective interpretation. Revision of personal habits, for example, what the hell does that mean, and how in the world can you assign 76 LCUs to a change in your life event? So what does that mean? A change to your habits. They want me to move my office from over by the library to this building. How stressful is that going to be if I move?
I think it'd be good.
Why?
If you have a window here.
I don't.
Oh, okay.
Nobody's got a window here. Look at the walls. Do you see any windows? We're right up against the outside of the building right here.
Well, at least you have the coffee shop right there.
I don't drink coffee. I don't drink any warm liquids. I know, I'm boring as hell. I don't drink, tea, I'm sorry. You brought me some tea, and I appreciate that. But
We'll
Jeremiah.
We'll twist you around and get you drinking tea.
Yeah.
Jeremiah drinks tea. Assigning numbers to select events doesn't take into account individual differences in event appraisal. In other words, so I competed in the state softball tournament. How stressful is that? I had to drive all the way to Missoula. I was living here and had to drive all the way to Missoula. It was a long drive, but I love to drive. I really love to drive. So spring break, I get to go see my wife. I haven't seen my wife in about a month. And by then it'll be 2 months, damn it. Okay, so I get to visit my wife, and that's a real positive thing, but I have to drive 1,500 miles to get there. I have to stop in Oklahoma City. So how stressful is that going to be going to visit my wife? I have to drive 1,500 miles. But I love to drive, so it's not going to be that bad. And I can't wait to see her anyway, so I'll be thinking of seeing my wife anyway. So it all depends. I mean, if you hate to drive, then me going home would be a really traumatic event. Having to drive 1,500 miles, 2 days. You just drove down from Chicago. How horrible was it? You went through Denver though, didn't you?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. See, I don't like driving in the mountains.
Yeah, I'm not a fan either, but my brother.
Yeah, you have to see your brother.
It's
I'm a
like
flatlander.
Is that like over 24 hours? Chicago?
Yeah, 26, I think.
Yeah,
Going by
26,
Denver.
27 hours. Yeah, we live up by Chicago, up near Chicago, in Iowa. Life event scales tend to lump all events together, whether positive or negative, and sometimes events will balance themselves, creating far less stress than predicted. And of course, that will be driving home. I'll be driving home with my dog and my 2 cats, with a car full of empty pop cans because my daughter recycles everything.
It'd be more stressful coming down though.
It is,
It seems like it's
because
more exciting.
I'm
coming
leaving
home.
my wife, yeah, it always is, more stressful coming down. And it's a 2-day trip, and my butt gets tired. I don't have a whole lot of meat on my fanny, so it gets really tired sitting in that damn seat. Unexpected or uncontrollable events are much more stressful than planned events. Many inventories do not differentiate between resolved and unresolved events. Some people cannot handle change. If something happens that they don't expect, they go wacko. They really get, it really stresses them out. Obsessive compulsive, people with obsessive compulsive disorder, they have to do the same thing all the time. If we see people with autism, everything has to be exactly the same. They can't handle difference. They can't handle change. So there are select individuals that will react more negatively to these things, as weird as that is. Other individuals, like me, I've lived everywhere and I've done lots of different things. And so not knowing what's going to happen next doesn't bother me at all. I hate cities. I love living out in the country, but sometimes you get moved, sometimes your assignment is Los Angeles. Another time your assignment is Washington, D.C. Another time your assignment is, Berlin, Germany. My God, who's doing this to us? Or moving to Japan. You guys have never seen Japan. We're going to talk about how horrible Japan is. Maybe I'll show you right now. Let me show you how crowded Japan is. Excuse me. I got it here somewhere. Or maybe I don't. There it is. Okay, there's Japan. That's how crowded Japan is. It's ridiculous. I think I've got it. Yeah, there you go. Look at that. They push you onto the subway. This is Tokyo. Can you imagine? I told you the story of my Japanese stewardesses. Oh, well, I'm not going to tell you today. Anyway, yeah, and everybody stands right up next to you. You have no personal space whatsoever, and they're right next to you. And of course, I'm from Indiana. My personal space is like from here to the door. I'm comfortable with that. You're just too close to me. I need to back up to get away from you. But in Japan, there is no personal space. You got somebody right here. And luckily, they all eat fish, and their breath smells like fish. It's really kind of strange. You can look how close these people are. They're in line, and look how close they are to each other. As weird as that is. Okay. So that can be stressful as well. Wherever I was. Leave it to me to get lost. Okay, unexpected or uncontrollable events are much more stressful than planned events. Of course, we talked about that. Many inventories do not differentiate between resolved and unresolved events. Life event scales tend to underestimate the stress on minorities because of their status. Now, the reality is, if you're a minority, and you guys are a minority as far as the rest of the United States is concerned, but if you come to Dene College, you're a majority here. I'm the minority. So I feel funny here, because I'm the minority. I live in an octagonal house with no square. There's nothing square in that whole damn house. How do you put up a wall? How do you put up a wall in an octagonal house? Well, one side has, it's like 270 degrees. The other one is like, 30. I got angles like this in my house. What do you put in there? What are you supposed to put in there? I know, I haven't figured it out yet. Anyway, so I'm a minority, and I understand how it feels. I've lived in black neighborhoods, I've lived in Hispanic neighborhoods. I've lived in neighborhoods where nobody spoke English. They spoke Spanish, and it was Dominican, okay? It was a dialect of Spanish. So half the time I didn't understand the Spanish words that they were using. I've lived in Germany, where Germans are Germans. I've lived in Japan. I've lived in Korea. We won't talk about Vietnam. Researchers looking at the nuclear power plant meltdown at 3 Mile Island, this was in 1979, I'm sure all of you remember it, discovered that residents in the area suffered for more than a year with chronically excessively high blood pressure, with cortisol levels, with epinephrine levels, and norepinephrine levels. I mentioned this to you guys before. You have 2 surges of cortisol during the day. No matter who you are, no matter what racial group you come from, you always have a cortisol spike at 8 o'clock in the morning and at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Now, 8 o'clock in the morning is very logical. You need to wake up and you need to make sure that you're not being attacked by some predator. But why 4 o'clock in the afternoon? What is it about 4 o'clock in the afternoon? Why would we have a cortisol spike at 4 o'clock in the afternoon?
After eating.
Eating? We're eating our evening meal? We're arguing with our family at the table? Is that what's happening? Why at 4 o'clock? We need to think well beyond octagonal houses and food. Why at 4 o'clock in the afternoon? What is it that we're trying to stay away from? Well, we had to wake up so we could, the predators. We had to worry about the predators. But what's happening at 4 o'clock in the afternoon? Every single one of you guys have a spike at 4 o'clock, and it's just after 4. So you're probably just a little bit wired right now. The Dr. Pepper used to say you needed to drink a Dr. Pepper at 10 o'clock, at 2 o'clock. Wait a minute. 10, 2, and 4. You need to drink 3 Dr. Peppers every day, 10, 2, and 4. It's still on the Dr. Pepper bottle. 10, 2, and 4. That's when you have the low energy levels. Well, 10 o'clock, it's 2 hours after your cortisol spike. But why 4 o'clock? What's 4 o'clock got to do with anything?
I heard it was 3.
I'm sorry?
I heard it's 3 o'clock.
3 o'clock what?
Like, you become more tired.
Yeah, 4 o'clock. It's 4 o'clock. You need a surge at 4 o'clock. You need to eat a Snickers at 3 o'clock. But at 4 o'clock, you have a cortisol spike. So why in the world would you have a cortisol spike at 4 o'clock? We need to find some place to sleep away from the predators. We need to find for the night. So it's at 4 o'clock you have that cortisol spike in order to find some place to sleep. I know, it's stupid, isn't it? But if you draw cortisol levels on somebody all day long, then you'll see an 8 o'clock spike and you'll see a 4 o'clock spike. Not just in adults, but in kids. We used to do this on kids to find out why they had ulcers. And if they had an excessive cortisol level at 4 o'clock and 8 o'clock, then it meant that they had too much of the stress hormone. They were putting off too much stress hormone, as weird as that is. When I worked in a pediatrics clinic, in Omaha, Nebraska. Anyway, okay, so we have a cortisol spike at 4 o'clock and 8 o'clock in the afternoon. After the 9/11 terrorist attacks on the Pentagon, mental surveys identified 40% of the Pentagon staff were at high risk for PTSD, panic attacks, depression, generalized anxiety, and alcohol abuse. Now remember, these are soldiers. We're not just talking about common everyday people. We're talking about people who have been trained to handle these kinds of stressful situations. But remember what happened coming out of Vietnam. A third of the individuals suffered from PTSD. And it didn't matter what kind of combat they were in or whether they were in combat at all. A third of the people still suffered from PTSD. These people were not in combat. Of course, they were attacked by terrorists, but they still developed PTSD, 40% of them. It's about the same figure, 33% and 40%. So some people are more susceptible to PTSD, and usually that has to do with what happened to you as a child, whether you were traumatized as a child. And if you were traumatized, then potentially, of course, we have a negative reaction. Statistics also showed that there was a statistically significant increase in the blood pressure among 4 large samples of patients hospitalized around the United States for 2 months after the attacks and the 9/11 attacks. This was New York City. Of course, everybody got to watch it on television, except me. I didn't have a television at the time. They looked at people in Washington, D.C., which was attacked, in New York, which was attacked, but the people in Chicago and Mississippi also had elevated levels, and they weren't attacked at all. I was living in Montana at the time, and people in Montana were scared to death we were about to be attacked by terrorists. Who would attack Montana? What's in Montana to attack? But they were still afraid that they were afraid that they would be attacked. And so that they had all of these elevated results. From 4 disparate places as Mississippi, Chicago, New York, and Washington, D.C. Of course, 2 of those places were attacked. They weren't attacking hospitals, but they were still attacking. There was a significant increase in symptoms of PTSD after the tsunami in Sri Lanka in 2004, and that's what it looked like when it hit the tsunami. There was a significant increase in symptoms of PTSD after the levee break in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina in 2005. During the 2000 Intifada by Palestinians on the Gaza Strip, psychologists noted a sharp increase in anxiety, acute stress disorder, PTSD, depression, and panic attacks. This was in Palestine. Children in the Gaza Strip had a surge in bedwetting, nightmares, and behavioral disorders. These were little guys. They started wetting the bed. As curious as that is. We're not done. Wait a minute. I got one more tsunami. Are you ready? MRIs taken of Japanese university students before and after the 2011 earthquake showed that those who experienced the most symptoms of PTSD, intrusive memories, and heightened startle response had decreased brain volume in the region of the anterior cingulate cortex. Reduced volume. And this is what it looked like when it hit. I know, that's fun. There's your cingulate. There you go. That's where it is. So that area of the brain was actually reduced in size. We have to stop right now because those guys are going to start knocking on the door.